to thank everybody for coming. I'd like to thank Mark and Melly for having me. It's very nice. It's interesting this time of year. We got about a year of online tournaments now under our belts, and amazingly, there's over-the-board tournaments coming back pretty soon. The first one I know of is regular tournament, Chicago Open end of May. So anyway, let's get it started. My rule is basically that I don't want everybody to be muted. You don't have to raise your hand. I'd like you to participate. It should be an interactive lecture. And if the only time someone will be muted is if they go off script and start chomping chips or something like that, like one time. So Mark, where do I see the list of participants? Is there any way to?
Yeah, so you should have a banner at the top of your screen that you can click on the More button. And that'll show you the participants, or somewhere in that menu, there's the participants. Once you have that window open, you can hover over each participant and click on Allow to Talk.
Okay. Although can everybody be unmuted already, or how do I do that?
I can just do that right now if you want.
Yeah, do that, because I'm having trouble finding everybody.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Oh, here we go.
Yep.
All right. So once I get to More, it should be. Okay, I see. Excellent. Great. All right, I see people now. All right. Well, welcome everybody. Okay, cool. So let me start by just showing the agenda for tonight. Present. These are my professional slides. So the main topic for tonight is activity in the endgame. As you guys know from my past lectures, I like to help people learn at my own expense. And basically I show everybody all my failures and what I'm trying to learn from them. And this is no different. So we can all watch me play bad moves and hopefully not do the same in our own games, right? But there's more to it too, because basically here's the agenda. I want to first talk a little bit about calculation, a very important topic, and show how it's related to one of my games. And then I was trying to choose one game to give in a full game because I like the full game interaction. And it turns out I recently played just this week a blindfold practice game or training game with a partner of mine. It actually had a lot of cool stuff to it, so I want to show that one, and also ask questions of you guys. But then the main topic is activity in endgame, where we're going to go over snippets of games that shows maybe a new way of thinking about how to play the endgame. Now, to some of you, playing dynamically and playing actively will be second nature, and you'll find that you're much better at it than I am. That's great. But hopefully there'll be some of you out there that, like me, struggle to understand the nature of dynamics versus statics. And hopefully these will be good examples and show you, kickstart you into thinking a little bit differently in the endgame. Okay? I didn't introduce myself. I assume pretty much everybody knows who I am. So we'll go on from there. Okay. So the first thing I'd like to do is show you this. I'm really impressed. I'm always looking for good chess books. And we can see this now, but I stumbled upon this book actually in Barnes and Noble of all places. It's called 600 Modern Chess Puzzles. And it's by Martin Kravtsov, who is a GM. Okay, and I've got tons of calculation and puzzle books, but the one thing I can say about this one that exceeds all others is that it has positions that are more like real games. And what I found by going through all these things, the way they have the puzzles presented is it's very much like the choices you have in every game that you play. It's not always white to move and win, checkmate, winning a rook, that kind of stuff. It's oftentimes the right moves just lead to an unclear position, but it's the best you can do. And I'd like to, one of these puzzles struck me, and I'd like to show you that right now. This is puzzle number 179. So in this chapter, he just gives you a question to answer, and you have to figure it out. So can everybody see? I assume everybody can see the screen. And the question is, it's black to move. Okay? We're seeing from black's perspective. And you have to answer the question, can you take the pawn on e5 with the bishop or the knight? And if so, which piece should it take it with? So let's talk about this. How do you go about trying to figure this out? Any advice? feel free to speak out. It's no problem. Everybody should be allowed to unmute. Okay, well, right, might be a little early for people to participate, but all right, clearly the idea is, let's see, is there a chat? Anyway, obviously you have to calculate, but the point is, in general, with all tactics, as we've learned through being beaten over the head by this, is you have to look at forcing moves first, right? Okay. So in this position, what you're going to start doing is pick a move, pick a capture with either the bishop or the knight, and calculate it, right? Calculate it using the forcing moves. So let's start. So let's assume that we start with the knight, because the knight to me is by far the most natural capture. And we might envision that we play knight takes e5. Okay. So what would be the most forcing move for white after that capture? Anyone? Bueller? Melly?
Okay, so the most, let's get it started, right? So
Let's get it started.
The most forcing is knight takes e5, right? You're
Actually, technically no, but thanks for playing. You get a consolation. It's board game.
okay. Well, I made a fool of myself just to encourage.
No, not at all. Knight takes e5 is probably the most rational forcing move, but the most forcing move is checks, right? So a check would be like a queen b3 check or a queen c4 check, which you have to watch out for. However, we can see right away that those two forcing checks fail instantly, right? Queen c4 check fails to knight takes c4, and queen b3 check fails to rook takes b3. But you're right, Melly, absolutely right. So the most natural forcing move is knight takes e5. Okay, and continuing on, what do you think black would play then, Melly?
I'm guessing knight takes e5, knight takes e5, bishop
Yeah,
takes
and then
e5.
yeah, bishop takes e5, right?
But then rook takes e5, queen takes e5, bishop f4 seems to,
Right.
well, yeah, seems to win for white.
That's right. So what Melly's saying is that you have a very natural sequence of capture.
Okay.
Knight takes e5, knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, rook sack, rook takes e5, queen takes e5, and we see that the queen on a4 supports bishop to f4. Does everybody see that? And now it's skewer the queen and skewer the rook, really, skewer the queen and the rook. All right, so that's good calculation. All right, so now if you're calculating this as a game, should you stop there and say just white wins?
I would look for ways to deflect the queen if I can, like rook b4.
Okay, and why? What led you to think about that?
Oh, so what's the material count? I want a pawn. Knight takes, bishop takes. So I'm up a pawn and then and the exchange, right?
Yep.
So I can give back the exchange, rook b4, c takes b4, queen takes f4, and remain up a pawn.
That's right, exactly. Now, is that the end of our calculation? Do we stop there and say everything seems okay?
A pawn on a7 is hanging.
Right, so you can go there and say queen takes a7. Okay. Right. I mean, there are a couple ways white can try to get out of it, or white can try to get out of it, right? You can play queen takes b4, right? When you play rook b4. Or you can play c takes b4, right? I suppose you can also play bishop takes e5. Those are all forcing moves, correct? So bishop takes e5 is pretty simple to dismiss because we play rook takes a4 and the queen the rook is not attacked there, so we just win material. But c takes b4 is what you specify, right, Nelly? And for that, we can envision playing c takes b4, taking the queen. He has to take our queen, bishop takes e5. I'm sorry, c takes b4, rather. I'm mixing them lines. C takes b4, queen takes f4. Okay. And then we have a choice between queen takes b4, I guess, or queen takes a7. If we take an a7, then the knight on a3 hangs, so that's no good. Okay, so it looks like we might play queen takes b4 and call it just about an unclear position. Right. And if we take with the queen on b4, then c takes b4, and we're attacking the knight. So when the bishop takes the queen on e5, the knight hangs. let's see how that works in practice. When knight takes e5, knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, rook takes e5, queen takes e5, bishop f4, good calculation. And we realize that white is about to win a rook for free, but it doesn't quite work because we can counterattack with an equal or stronger threat, it's called, with rook to b4. And here we can see that white has no great way of getting out of this. However, white is not dead. For instance, if he plays here, he can do what Melly said and just take an a7, and the position is still somewhat unclear. It's not like black is winning. Similarly, we have, queen takes here. We takes, and this is bad for, well, it probably is survivable for white. Here's another way to get to a roughly even position. Okay. Now, the only thing we didn't do in this position was check that after knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, white now does indeed have a check, and you have to check these things, or you can be in for a big surprise. But as we see here, you can block the check with an attack of your own with d5, and that'll kick the queen away, and black gets to keep his pawn. I mean, I guess you can take queen takes c5 here, of course. But once you see this, that you've traded a doubled c pawn for a nice central e pawn, you say this is probably pretty good for black, right? All right, so why did I show you this puzzle? The key is it's very easy to go through a sequence like this. See rook takes e5 and congratulate yourself for seeing such a nice sacrifice. And bishop f4 and just stop, right? Because it looks like you just have lost material. But it's always often good to push yourself to go one more move and see if there's any way to get out of this situation. And Melly correctly saw rook b4 very quickly, which is nice. But good. So let me show you something that then happened in one of my own games. So here's a game I played very recently against GM Gusenov. Not exactly sure where he's from. And unfortunately, he'd been kind of pushing me around the entire game. As you can see, it's black. After black just played rook on c to d8, just trying to hold on for dear life. And so as you can see, the white pieces are very active. We've got an incredible knight here on f5. The rook has penetrated the 7th. He's got a strong passed d pawn that actually can become weak, but it can be a tactical asset. And obviously his king's pretty safe, and his pieces are just great. He's sacrificed the pawn to get here. He sacrificed his f pawn, so black actually technically is up a pawn right now. But the only thing I can hope to use that pawn for is a distraction. I was kind of hoping to use it as a distraction to distract this rook so I could do something in the meantime. So here it was white to move, and I was waiting for his move. And there are all kinds of good moves for white here. The best of which probably is rook to d4. The other one that attacks both pawns. The other one that came to mind actually was interesting was rook e1. Okay, but that one a little bit suspect. But what he played was interesting. He played rook to f1. All right. Now let's see. How would you guys? Well, first of all, what would you think of a move like rook to f1 in this position? Just in general terms. You know, what's your gut feeling, intuition? Anyone? Okay. So I can tell you what I thought. It just seemed a very odd move to me. When all this time he's pressing and putting his pieces on active squares, and now he goes after my f pawn. It rang alarm bells in my head that maybe something was up. And in fact, it's not hard to see that the rook was on d1, it was covering the d pawn. Now that it's moved, it's pretty simple to see that black actually can take the d pawn, right? Because if I take the d pawn with the rook, and he recaptures my rook with the knight was covering his e7 rook, so I would be able to take on e7 and be very happy. Okay. So I did this, and then he played rook takes g7, which is forced. All right. So now, do you see any ideas here for black? All right, don't all jump at once. Anybody call it any move?
Jeff, are you able to see the chat? People are writing ideas.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm hoping people would just see chat. Unfortunately, I can't see the chat right now. Let's see. Oh crap! Where's the chat?
Do you see the bar above at the top?
I do, and under more it says chat. Oh, here it is. It finally came up. It's weird. Ah, okay. So people are typing. Thank you for the typing. I appreciate it. Gotta find a place to put the window. Okay. Let me read the comments here for a second. Okay. All right, good. Yeah, too passive. I'm assuming that's about the rook move to F1. All right, cool. So either in the chat or feel free to speak up, please. Do you see any interesting ideas for black? So clearly, black is pretty desperate here, right? And when you think about it, his pawn structure is completely ruined on the king side. These active pieces are crawling all over his position. Black is kind of desperate. So when you're desperate, you got to look for really active ideas. Nice to look for them even when you're not desperate. But does anybody have any kind of suggestions here to look into? It doesn't have to be a great move, just ideas.
F3.
Yeah, okay, that's a good one. F3. Now that's well motivated because if you play F3, then one cool thing is that if the rook takes it, we have rook to D1 mate, right? Okay, so you can't take the pawn right away. All right. Very good. That's one idea. Does anybody have another idea?
Knight e4 maybe to threaten knight g3.
Yeah, that's an idea. Okay, knight e4. You can't take the pawn in f4. Another kind of weird thing. And then knight g3. That's an idea. Okay, keep going.
But rook h7 looks strong, unfortunately.
Oh, I got a suggestion here. Hey, that's a good try. It's always good to look for these things too. Very forcing moves. I like it. Rook d1 check. The idea is to get rid of this rook on the first rank so we can push our pawn. And it's a creative idea. And the only issue is that after sacking a rook here, the king for one is a little bit too close and it can stop the pawn itself. It's a good idea, yeah. So it's a nice try. We got to keep that stuff in mind because you never know what's going to work. I mean, maybe after F3, well, even F3, it's a little too close to the king, but you know, at some point it actually could work. If we got the pawn to F2, then rook d1 check might actually work. So the idea that intrigued me during the game, thank you very much for your participation. I hope we do more of it, was the move b3. Okay. And what does that move do? Any guesses? Okay. The idea behind b3 is to open up more lines against the king. Okay. First of all, after b3, if we push our pawn here, okay, it's easy to see that if the pawn on c file takes, then we can simply play rook c6 and threaten a pretty big discovered attack against the king. That's promising. Also, if we imagine that he takes with the A pawn, which is kind of the most natural move, A takes B3, this capture from the pawn on the edge of the board. Then we can play rook A6, okay, and threaten rook A1, which would be checkmate. Of course, he's not going to allow that. And I thought, okay, I play rook A6, and I saw him playing king B1. And here's the problem. I was looking at all kinds of sacrifices over here to try to break through on the queen side, like knight takes B3, trying to somehow get my other rook over in the A file, which wasn't working. I was so focused on that part of the board, I didn't look at any other part of the board. So can anybody see the killer blow after B3, A takes B3, rook A6, and king B1? I think it's a chat. Chat is right here. Okay. Sorry. Nobody?
Rook D2 looks good.
Okay, rook D2. And what does that threaten?
Knight D3.
Into D3. This is after A takes B.
Yeah, AB, rook A6,
Rook
king
A6,
B1.
B1. Rook D2.
Oh, sorry, I thought it was C takes B3 for a second.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So does anybody see the move I missed? No. Okay. So the move I missed, because I just didn't look far enough, I didn't look at what one extra move is knight E4. Let me show you how it would work. If I had calculated properly and found B3, A takes B3, rook A6, we're threatening to go down and checkmate him with rook A1. It's to play king B1. And if I just looked a little further, and it could look a little bit more toward the left side of the board instead of just focusing on this area on the queen side, I would have found knight E4. It's not even a difficult move. And this not only threatens to fork the rook on with knight D2 check coming up, that would be this move. Okay. But also, it threatens to play knight D2 even if the rook moves. Say the rook moves, clearly it can't leave the back rank because that would allow rook to D1. So for instance, if rook F4, we have rook D1 mate. And if we have, say, rook to G1 just getting out of the way, we still have knight D2 check, king C1, and rook A1 mate. So that would have won. So after B3, he can't take with the A pawn. For similar reasons, he can't take with the C pawn, because after rook C6, we're also threatening to play knight E4 check. Knight E4 check would force king to B1. So this is a threat. And then we play knight to D2 check, winning the rook, or actually, yeah, winning the rook. This is winning as well. And finally, if he doesn't take, let's say we're threatening as well, also by way after B3 to take on A2, and then we would queen the pawn. So we have to do something about this for white. So he plays maybe A3. And can anybody see the great move after A3? Chess not coming up. Yeah, the great move after A3 is simply rook to D2. And now we have an entry point on C2 with the rook. We're threatening rook takes C2 check next, and we can put the other rook down and kill him with our two rooks and our knight and pawn. So he only can play that. We take there, it goes there, and then we go something like rook to G2, and we put a rook down in D2, and we're the ones attacking, and this wins too. So what does this all mean? So this is proof that GMs are human. I'm sure he was bored with toying with me and thought he could just win the game any old way, which makes sense. And he just got a little bit, let's say, distracted for 1 minute, and shows that even GMs are human. And if I had calculated this out like that puzzle, where I just looked one more move, I would have found a winning line against in this game. As it was, since I didn't see that, I played a terrible move, rook to d2. And unfortunately, in my calculations, I was probably doing it very quickly because I was frustrated not finding a good line. I gave myself probably 2 moves in a row because I had forgotten that after rook h7, he's threatening to go rook h8 now. And that would win the, well, actually, he would be able to win the h6 pawn or trade-off stuff and get rid of any kind of counterplay I might have. So I played this awful move, king g8, and realized that after rook to c7, he's not only gained a tempo on my knight, my free knight here, but he gets knight to h6 check, and he's actually mating me. Okay, so for instance, if I save my knight, like let's say I just go here or something like that, just to attack the rook. Yeah, he actually has this check. I can't even go to h8 because if I go to h8, he forks me. And if I go here, I'm getting mated because of this and this. And rook e1. So I really had no choice but to resign. I think I played some lame moves. Played moves like knight e6, trying to plug up the e file, but it's pretty easy to see I get into a horrible pin. And this pin is just deadly. It's over. My rook on d2 hangs. So that's a cautionary tale. When you calculate in lines, you basically can't end early. Okay, you got to always look for the one more forcing move. All right, that's that for tactics. Okay, so next, I'm going to move on to this game I played. This is actually an interesting game. My training partner and I, probably about twice a month, we play Blindfold Games. Yeah, it's games where we play it on chess.com, and we play a game without sight of the pieces. Okay. We can see the notation, but we can't see the actual pieces on the board. It's really good practice for visualization, for board visualization. And we played a really interesting one this week that I wanted to show to people. Our time limit is 45 minutes plus 10-second increment for the whole game. So let's try to make this interactive. I played a really unassuming opening, but it soon transposed to a very English-like setup. And he played this modern move order, the modern defense, where he actually played knight d7 early, which usually means that you're going to play e5. I castled, but then he switched plans and played c5. And I thought, okay, you know, the knight on d7 is not ideally placed for this structure because you'd rather have this knight right here. You'd rather have him on c6, right? So already black is just a little bit passive. So I transposed to some kind of English setup with c4. Okay. I took back, got a nice centralized knight at the expense of center pawn. He played knight f6, I played knight c3, all natural moves. And one of the keys to this game is this bishop here. The bishop is really strong on this diagonal, and black has to figure out a way to mitigate it. So he castled. I have nowhere to go on this diagonal for my bishop. So I just played a very logical move. I played b3. He played a5 to secure the c5 post for his knight. I played bishop b2, played knight c5. I just decided to develop my queen, and he played bishop d7. Okay, so here's the first point of interest. What do you think is the right move for white now? This is one thing I like about this game. It's got tactics, it's got prophylaxis, it's got defense, it's got positional maneuvers, all kinds of good stuff. So, shout it out. And unfortunately, when I try to bring up the chat, it's not reliable. So I'd appreciate it if you guys would use the use your voice. So unmute and talk, please.
Would it help to push e4 to get more center coverage?
Yeah, that's a good move. Okay, that's a good move. Yep. Now, there's only one drawback with that move, but it's actually a fine move. Okay. That being said, you know, it's a little bit committal because you are blocking out your own bishop, right? The bishop no longer has as much scope. So it's something you might not want to commit to right now because you don't have to, right? But it's not a bad move at all. However, the thing when you're especially playing chess where there's no tactics and no imminent skirmishes and that kind of thing, is you always kind of want to think about what your opponent's trying to do, and if you can prevent it. Okay, Black actually has a threat right here that you should consider meeting. Can anybody see what the threat is?
He probably wants to push a4.
Yes, that's correct. He wants to push a4. Very nice. And if we play b4, what would he do, Millie?
a3.
Yeah, he would push a3, right? And notice that when he pushes a3, we really don't want to trade our wonderful bishop here for that knight, even though the knight's good, especially since our pawn structure would be terrible at the end. But you notice that the bishop doesn't really have anywhere good to go. If we wanted to save our bishop, we would have to go back to c1, which is very uncoordinated, right? So with that in mind, now that you've actually seen what, or figured out what your opponent's threat is, what would your recommendation be for a move now? Don't make me start calling on people. Come on now. Putting you on the spot.
Does knight d5 work?
Let me do this way. I can actually see the chat. Yeah. Okay. Very nice. Okay, I see somebody in the chat. Okay, I can see it now. The chat where somebody said a4 and knight d5. Okay, well, knight d5 is a whole different animal, right? First of all, does it stop him from playing a4?
Well, I was thinking it gives the bishop c3.
Okay, I see. That's nice. Yeah, the one problem though is that at this moment, I don't think you want to play knight d5 and allow knight d5 and c takes d5, which would shut out your own bishop, right? I'm not sure that's a positional transformation you want at this moment.
I would take with the bishop, but yeah, probably
Yeah.
you don't want to trade pieces.
Yeah, and if you take with the if you take with the bishop, that's not desirable for white either, just because you're not really gaining anything from that trade except easing the cramp in black's position, right? So the bishop would just be hanging there. It could be hit by e6 at the right moment. Yeah, that trade just doesn't quite pull the desired effect for white, but it's interesting to give the idea. You got the right idea, and giving the bishop the c3 square is good, but think much simpler than that. The idea is you want to give it the a1 square so it can stay on this diagonal, right? So the logical move is to move the rook. So what we do is we move the rook to c1, or we can move it to d1. I picked c1. It's tough to say which place it really belongs on, but rook c1 seemed fairly natural to me. This means that if black now plays a4, we can play b4. And when he plays a3, we can at least play bishop a1, and everything is still coordinated, right? It's not necessarily terrible for black. He can play knight a4, but at least we've gotten rid of his nice c5 knight. So he didn't play that. Instead, he played queen c8. Okay, and there should be no real points for guessing what the purpose of this move is. And clearly what he wants to do is he wants to put his bishop on h3 and trade off our wonderful bishop, and that's how he's trying to mitigate the power of this bishop on the long diagonal, the g2 bishop. So he wants to play here, and he wants to trade off this guy. Now, I'm not going to torture you with a question here. It's actually a fair game, say whether you want to retain your bishop or not. Because if you do play, somebody suggested earlier, e4, that's really not a bad idea. You could play, for instance, what I played in the game, I played rook fe1 to keep my options open. If you do that by moving the rook from f1 when he plays bishop h3, you have an option to retreat the bishop and save it because it's not pinned to the rook. But now I was really considering playing e4 because once you put the pawns in the center on white squares, the bishop doesn't have any scope anyway, and you don't mind trading it off. Notice how you really probably don't want to take here and allow the queen in, even though you probably can get rid of it with knight f3 or but knight g4 is a threat now, somewhat of a threat. So you'd rather either preserve the bishop or let him trade. I decided in the end to preserve the bishop. It's completely arbitrary. Both are pretty good. Okay, so let's get to the next interesting point. He played h5, which is a thematic move. He might soften me up later with h4. You just want to secure more of the g4 square. All right. So now we got to figure out what to do for white. And I couldn't really figure out anything else to do other than what someone suggested before, which is to play e4, gaining space. So like I said, it's not a bad move at all. And now I really kind of expected to play knight to g4 here, him to play knight to g4, be very aggressive, and try to use his pieces over here for some kind of attack. He's got a pressure on the d4 knight for the bishop. And he's got a chance to play maybe queen to d8 and b6. If he could get his queen magically to here in a couple moves, this could be some annoying pressure. Plus, the last part of this is that after knight g4, you also would be able to play knight e5. And these two knights right here would be looking at the d3 square, which is very sensitive, and also f3. Okay. Can anybody see the drawback to knight g4 and why it doesn't work?
Now knight d5 looks very strong.
Okay, yeah, knight d5 makes sense. Okay, exactly. Thank you for the chat, Greg. Knight d5 is a good move, and obviously it's a big juicy target. We play knight d5, and then if we can fork him on this square, that'd be wonderful, right? But of course, he's not going to allow that. So let's say he just plays a normal move like queen to d8 to cover that fork. What do we do then? It's actually not that easy to see from afar for sure. And it's not even really easy to see right here. But white has a way to essentially win a piece right now. Anybody see it? If you look at all of black's pieces, which one has the least scope right now and looks the most trapped? Ah, very good. I see it in the chat. Very nice. Yeah, someone mentioned it. Greg, nice job. Knight f4. Yep. The bishop is trapped. So all we have to do is attack it. And the beautiful knight, which is on d5, this is why it's hard to see, because oftentimes it's very difficult to move beautifully placed pieces like the knight on d5 backwards. But knight f4 attacks the bishop and he loses the bishop. You might be able to, I mean, you can't even really scrounge around with any, I mean, there's no way to save it. So good. So knight g4 would have caused problems for black, but he still wanted to get the knight to e5, so he played knight and f to d7. Okay. And now my next question is, what would you play here for white? So the first question you should ask too is, let's try to break it up into easier parts. Instead of what we would play, what does black want to do, or what is he threatening here?
Seems like black maybe wants to win that d3 square after 95, maybe.
Very nice. Yes, he's threatening to play knight e5. So we got to keep that in mind. All good players, they first see what the opponent's up to. They can choose to ignore it, okay, or they can choose to address it, but you always have to know what they're up to, and that's exactly right. He wants to get to e5 and then to d3. Or maybe some strange tactic might appear on f3, who knows. So very good, very good. Thank you for the input. Yep, I see it in the chat too. Very nice, Michael. Very nice. Okay, so, all right, so we can choose to try to stop that. And obvious move to stop that would be F4. Okay, but you know, you can also look for your own active possibilities. Can anybody see any interesting active moves here for white?
Does knight f5 work?
What's your idea?
So something like knight f5,
Mhm.
g takes f5, knight d5, queen d8,
Mhm.
queen g5. No, sorry, bishop takes g7, king takes g7, queen g5 check, king h7, queen takes h5, and I pick up the bishop on h3.
That's exactly right. Very nice. Very nice. That's excellent. But I missed it. Knight F5 is a cool move. It's something I regret. I sort of was looking that way, but didn't quite get to the right conclusion. Now, there's one thing. Now, Melly's completely right. I'm not, no criticism whatsoever. But when calculating this, knight F5 is where he showed the main line already, which is G takes F5, knight D5, threatening the fork on E7, and opening up this bishop diagonal. Queen D8 is one of these. You have to save the queen, right? Well, not, you don't necessarily, but that's the main line. The most natural move is saving the queen. And then you simply take the bishop. Okay, the king has to take back for the king size room. Queen h6 is threatened. So king takes queen g5 check, king h7, queen takes h5, queen g7, and at the very least he loses his bishop. It turns out that, believe it or not, e takes f5 is actually stronger with a mating attack. But queen takes bishop is just fine. That is winning for white. So along the way, though, if you really want to calculate this properly, you have to think about another thing too. Very important, that after this, knight d5, black has already taken a piece. Oh yeah, we'll get to that in a second. Bishop takes f5. Very nice. I see in the chat. But anyway, he's already won a piece, so you have to wonder what happens if he just goes ahead and gives up the queen for material, right? Don't miss these things in your games and just assume he has to save his queen. Of course, we would take on e7. He has to go to h7 here, or else we would pick up the bishop with check. Okay, on queen takes b2. But now when we take the queen, he has an intermediate move instead of just capturing the knight back of playing bishop takes c1. We would take it with the queen, and then he takes our knight. And we have to assess this position. And the important thing is that black has plenty of material for the queen. He has a 2 knights and a rook for a queen and a pawn, which is fine material balance for black. But what's his problem still? Yeah, his problem is this guy and this guy. They're loose pieces, right? The king is open and the bishop is loose. So we can play queen g5 here, which is something you have to see to justify this combination. I'm sure Melly would if he had a chance to really sit down and finish the calculation properly. But for the rest of us, we have to make sure we're diligent about this. And the only thing you can do to save his bishop temporarily is this. And then it's pretty easy to see we can knock it off that bridge by h3. And if he takes an h3, we take on h5 and then take on h3. And if he tries to save with rook g1, rook g8 rather, we play queen h4 and the bishop is done. And wait, that's very nice. I want to commend Melly for his quick tactical vision. That's good. As someone mentioned in the chat, there's another option. You can just play bishop takes f5. And that's a fine move that doesn't lose for black right away, but white is very happy after e takes f5. Why? Because first of all, he's got the 2 bishops now, and also he just opened up his beautiful bishop again. And he's opened up the rook, so the rook attacks this beautiful this pawn rather. It's a beautiful open file for white. And black can't even grab a pawn because then he'd lose the e7 pawn and the d6 pawn would fall after. So this is really a strategically winning position for white. So I missed that, unfortunately. It was a very good spot. And I played knight to d5, which actually is a very instructive mistake. Okay. It actually got me in a little bit of trouble. It was quite impulsive and stupid. I thought, well, his knight had retreated from f6, so the knight no longer protected d5, so I would jump right in. And the issue, though, is that I drive the black queen exactly where it wants to go. What we've talked about before is with the attack on the white king. Anytime a black attacks the white king, he wants his queen on b6, so I drove him to d8 right away. If I hadn't seen, well, assuming you don't see, this knight f5 idea, the best thing to do to stop knight e5 right away is play f4 and not help black get his queen to b6. So I played knight d5, a mistake. Not only missing the win with knight f5, but also forcing black where he wants to go. And then I felt compelled to play f4 to stop knight e5. Okay. And you can see now how insecure this king feels, right? Not only is it vulnerable on this diagonal right here, but one problem is that since I've preserved my bishop, the king really has nowhere to go. It can't go to h1. The bishop covers these important squares here on g2 and f1, and it's very uncomfortable. So that's kind of why I expected, well, my opponent played the right move here, e6. So you see, I've really not gained anything by playing knight d5. And here I had to figure out where to put the knight. And where would you guys put the knight? I'm assuming it really comes down to either knight to c3 or knight to e3. So which one do you like and why? Okay, so we have one vote for knight to c3. Because you can reroute it to b5 and attack the d6 pawn. All very valid points. All very valid points. So that is a great sentiment. Anybody else chime in? Any other opinions whether knight c3 or knight e3 is better? Okay, knight e3, we have a vote for knight e3. Any reasons or just intuition? Attacking f5. Okay, interesting. All right, so one of the moves, okay, it's very interesting to me, and this is kind of what I was hoping for because it gives us some more instructional value. Is I really like those answers. Those answers are very good, very good. The one problem with them though is that both the answers are dictated by what can white do. Okay, it's active plans. I want to get my knight to c3 and b5 and attack d6. Great idea. I'm going to get my knight to e3 so I can support an f5 push or something. Another attacking idea, all great. But the only thing is it doesn't take into consideration what our opponent is trying to do. Okay, so look at it from that vein. I really appreciate the responses. This is fantastic interaction. Look at it from what black wants to do, and then tell me again what you think of knight c3 or knight e3. Remember, we talked about how the king is insecure here, and black probably wants to get his queen after the knight moves to b6. Knight e3 blocks the dark squared bishop. Oh, yeah, okay. That is true, absolutely true. Okay, so we got a suggestion that knight e3 is a good try because knight c3 would block our own bishop on the dark diagonal and obviously that would make d4 a little weaker. But the real reason now knight c3 actually would be a mistake. Okay, it's the natural and desirable move, but it's a mistake because after queen b6, black has a huge threat of e5. Okay, notice that after e5, if our knight moves anywhere, he gets a free move with his knight and can devastate us with a discovered attack on the king. And unfortunately, there's no real great way to stop this. I mean, for instance, say you play bishop g2, trying to hope to get the king over to h1, you know, right away you get kicked by knight takes b3. Opening up now, you've got an attack on the queen, you got an attack on the knight by 2 people, and you have no time to take the bishop. So you see how disgusting that is. And if you say you go ahead and move the queen over to, I don't know, let's go to e3 to try to at least oppose the queen on a diagonal. Black has this great move, knight f6, when suddenly he's threatening knight g4, which would kick us from that diagonal because we can't stay on either of these 2 squares. And lo and behold, we would have to move it off the diagonal, then e5 comes and we're dead. So if there's anything I can impart a lesson kind of from this position, is that, you know, your own plans are nice, but it doesn't matter how good your own plans are if they're let's say trumped by your opponent's plan. So the only move here is knight to e3. This way you keep the diagonal bogged up, and queen b6 isn't quite as useful. All right, does that make sense? It's really what they call you know, instructors would call comparison. You have 2 moves, you got to compare the 2 and see which one's better. So I expected queen b6 here, and honestly, it's kind of tough to find a move for white here. He didn't play this in the game, my opponent, but any knight move by the, you know, the instinct here is to move the knight to safety, but any knight move loses. If we play, for instance, you know, knight f3, knight b5 rather, knight b5, then he simply takes on b2 and then forks us on d3. Oops. If we get the knight to f3, for instance, then he can do the same thing, or he can even take on e4 because we had to put our knight in e3. Obviously, knight c2 is terrible because the bishop would take on b2. So we have to sit there with our vulnerable knight. So here's a question. Say you got into this position as white. Do you have any idea what you could do to play and survive? You have e5 is still a big threat for black. Maybe not a big, maybe e5 is not a big threat. It's definitely unpleasant. If white doesn't come with a good move here, he could get killed. So any suggestions?
Bishop g2.
Yeah, bishop g2 certainly is a desirable move. I'm not positive it works. Let's see. Let's try to figure out. I know it's not one of the top moves, so let's see if we can figure out why.
I mean, the e4 pawn's hanging there, but
Yes, that's exactly right. You can take, yeah, you can't take back with the queen because the knight would come to d3. And then if you take back with the king, the fact that you couldn't bring your knight back to c3 hurts because knight takes e4. Yeah, so bishop g2 is not it. The move I was planning on playing, took a while to figure out, was bishop a1. Why? Because if you notice, all the times I tried to get the knight out of the way, the problem was bishop takes b2, queen takes b2, and knight splat on d3, right? So if we take the bishop out of this square, it doesn't lure the queen away to b2. So this is a good move and would have allowed me to have you know, rough equality. Sometimes those are kind of defensive preventive moves you got to play to stay in the game. But actually, there's a really neat idea here. That's one reason I want to show this game. That didn't even occur to me. And see if you can figure it out. It has to do, once again, with black's like best and worst piece, the bishop here. Okay, I don't see any responses, so I'll give it to you. Amazing move, amazing little maneuver that tidies up white's position. Knight to D1. Pretty cool. The idea is simply to go knight F2 next and kick that bishop. And not only that, the knight on F2 blocks this diagonal. Okay. And it also helps to uncover defenses to E4. Very good defensive move. It's hard to see. And now if E5, for instance, then we play knight F2 anyway. And for instance, say he plays bishop G4, we go knight B5, and we're happy. There's no discovered attack. And we're attacking the D6 pawn. And if he takes us, then we take on H3. And if he plays D3, then everything's covered. We go knight F2. And white is okay. So if you're even considering that, congratulations. Okay, but he didn't play queen B6. He gave me a moment of reprieve, a moment of respite with rook to A6. And now I had to try to figure out how to use my tempo. And here I actually got confused in my calculations, actually completely blundered. I should have played a simple move like rook on C to D1. I'm sure I didn't play it because I was worried about the rook later being hit by bishop G4. But somehow it's blindfold and I was, I'm sure the clock was ticking and I completely botched it and played knight to B5, which is a complete blunder. Can anybody see why that's a blunder? Yep, that's right. Very good. Bishop takes B2, queen takes, and knight D3 would win the exchange. Very nice. Very nice. Okay, so I got very lucky that my opponent believed me. Once again, blindfold sometimes can cause strange things to happen. And he played knight F6, which is another type of attacking move here where he wants to eventually maybe play knight G4. And I'm kind of glad he did because it led to another fascinating position very soon. So I corrected myself and realized that knight B5 was terrible as soon as I played it. I played queen C2 here to cover the E4 pawn. Notice that I briefly considered E5, but then you realize quickly that after D takes E5, queen takes, rook takes, you're just activating black. Takes here, knight G4. And white hasn't gained much at all from this, especially since after something like this, I can't contest the D file. And if I try to block the D file, it's pretty easy to see that rook takes D6 is possible. Oops, I guess we'll do this one. Because when the pawn takes, the bishop drops on B2. So that did not work at all. So instead, I just moved the queen over. Right. He played knight to G4. I took the opportunity just to trade the bishops, which makes sense. I didn't want bishop takes B2 and knight D3 again. And now I thought, why not check? First, I played rook CD1, attacking the D pawn. That's right. Covering the D3 square as well. He played queen E7, and now I checked him. And he can't block with the queen because then his D6 pawn would eventually fall. So he had to play king G8. Queen D4, a centralizing move. He took on E3. I took back with a queen, and he played E5. All right, so time to stop again and assess. Can you see any interesting ideas for white here? All right, we've got a great suggestion here. Michael noted that knight takes D6 is possible. All right, so let's calculate and see who it works out for here. All right, so the idea is to undermine the support of this knight. Okay. So if we calculate it, let's try to do it in our heads. We got knight takes D6, rook takes D6, queen takes C5. And now you have to look at rook takes D1, very forcing move. Now the queen is hanging on c5, so we have to play queen takes e7. He plays rook takes e1 check. We have to play our king to f2. And he bags the bishop on h1, rook takes h1. Who makes out in that deal, white or black? Yeah, unfortunately, black is much better there. I'll actually show it just so the people who don't necessarily like to follow along in their heads can see it for sure. You've got to go king f2 because it's the only square, and here, and white just doesn't quite have enough for the material. His queen is going to be overwhelmed. Yeah, oops. That's right. But it's important to see these things because, okay, it doesn't work this move, right? But to see those ideas, maybe it can work if you change things a little bit. So what I did was I said, well, I'd love to be able to play that. So why not set it up? And what's the one problem that kind of has been annoying me for a long time? It's a stupid bishop on h1. So I thought, well, that's the problem in this line as well, that the bishop hangs on h1. So why not give my king a little space and bring the bishop back into play? So I played bishop f3. Right. Now black probably had some better moves here, but he played e takes f4, which is reasonable. It's like back with a pawn. And now I'm threatening to play bishop takes h5, after which I could take the bishop on h3 with the queen. And we're getting low on time now, so my opponent just played bishop c8 just to get the bishop out of the way. You know, it's understandable. We're playing blindfold with time running down. It's really hard to be precise. Okay, but what's changed? Okay, now my bishop no longer is in the corner. And is that combination on or not off? What do you think? Yeah. See anything, but it's on. The queen, you end up with a game if essentially you get queen for 2 rooks and a pawn, but the thing is the queen at the end for white ends up in such a dominant position it actually makes up for any ills otherwise. So knight takes d6 is what I played. Rook takes d6. Queen takes. He played rook takes d1. It's pretty much the only move, or else you just lost a pawn for nothing. I suppose there are other considerations, but this is most obvious. Queen takes e7. Rook takes king f2. And of course, he played a very natural move, rook a1, trying to attack my pawn. All right, so here we are. Time's kind of running down. Critical moments in the game. You've got a great queen on e7. What do you suggest for white here? Any ideas? Okay, we have a suggestion for queen to g5, and we have a suggestion for pawn to a3. That'd be this move or this move. We have a suggestion for f5. Okay, great. Nice suggestions. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, the funny thing is that's none of those suggestions are what I played, and also none of those is the best move, which is funny. What I played actually wasn't all that great technically, but it had a good idea behind it. Let's check out. F5 actually is quite a decent attacking move. But honestly, it also, you know, black might survive and make it messy for a while, right? It's an attacking move, but okay, if you play f6 next, I guess you're going to play something like queen to f6 or queen to g5 next and just keep putting pressure on the king, which probably is very good. But let's take a look at the other moves. A3 actually saves the pawn, which is nice. It's not a bad idea. Not a bad idea at all. I suppose then that might be good enough. I wonder. Because the idea behind A3 would be to simply keep it so the rook can't take the pawn. And if the rook comes, say, to B1 to attack the B pawn, we can just keep pushing, right? That's not a bad suggestion at all. And queen G5. Queen G5 is another one that's similar to F5, right? I guess you want to play F5 next. I guess you have to deal with this. Figure out what to do next here. I guess we can play this. And then the idea probably is to push F5 next. So it's not a bad suggestion either. But it turns out the best move in this position, which is very interesting to me because it's really hard to move this queen from such a dominant square, is to play queen to A3. Now raise your hand if you saw that one. Does anybody see the threat besides just protecting the pawn and the threat of taking on A5? Exactly. Nice. Trapping the rook. Yep, the threat is queen to B2, and this rook is actually trapped. Isn't that amazing? So black has no time to save his A pawn and no time to, he can't take the A2 pawn, so he has to play something like rook to B1 to avoid getting a rook tracked. And then you simply take on A5, and yeah, black has absolutely no counterplay now. You can't even play rook to E8. It's pathetic. Now, my move was interesting. Tell you the idea behind it. I played E5. It turns out not to be the best move only because of a concrete reason that I missed. But I don't know if you guys have seen, but I had this shades in my mind of a great game. Has anybody ever seen the game Short versus Timon? The Great King March game?
What year was this?
I don't remember. It was sometime in the 1990, 89, something like that. I don't know. But it's a great game. It was actually in the Aiken's defense. And Nigel Short played white. And what he did was eventually marched his king all the way to H6 as white and mated black on G7. And I thought, why not do the same thing? You know, I was going to put my bishop on D5. I was going to put run my king up to G5 and H6. And the idea is that he can't stop it with king H7 because I have too much pressure on the F7 pawn. So he played the right move here. I started marching my king. And the thing I missed is that he could actually play bishop F5 here. And when I play bishop D5, he actually plays H4 check, and that kind of ruins the whole thing. If I take with the queen here, which is very hard to see, then he can start eating up my queenside pawns because he can play rook A3. Now notice the queen is no longer an E7, so he can grab my queenside pawn. If I take on H4 the king, then he can play this check, and I no longer can get my king to H6. So it's a shame because what I kind of envisioned here was that after E5, he would have played rook to B2, and I was going to go bishop D5. He was going to play here. I was going to play here, and then he's kind of screwed. You can go here, I go here, and I was going to go to H6 and mate him. Pretty funny. But in the end, once again, this is a blindfold game. We're down under a minute left here, and it's easy to make mistakes. And my opponent played rook to A3, and I'm sure most people can see the denouement. I played queen to A3, and he resigned. So I thought that was quite an interesting game. I know since, well, I'm not going to blame blindfold on all the mistakes. There are mistakes made, but I thought it was a lot of instructive points here. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you. I know there's one horrible move where I played knight to B5 and allowed the fork on D3. But apart from that, the moves were fairly reasonable. All right, so now on to the meat of the lecture. That was the first hour. This stuff, okay, it's time to dazzle you guys. There's one area of my game I've been trying to improve lately because of many failures, and that's learning about dynamics and initiative and activity. Okay, and I want to show you position here. This is from an online tournament game. So I was playing this guy. Amazingly, his handle is JQX 2019, which is funny because I'm JQ. I'm Jeff Quirk, and he had JQ in his title. But he was actually a 1900 player, and I had a great position. I was something like +6 or -6. For, black was ahead earlier, and I played this horrible hallucination blunder where I not only lost my advantage, but I actually ended up worse. I ended up in this worse ending. And not only that, I didn't have much time left either. So what we're trying to do here is, a lot of times when you get to the endings, especially in these online tournaments with sudden death time control, you have to play more by intuition than calculation a lot of times. And so you're trying to develop an intuition for what to do in these situations. And we pick it up here after I just played rook b1. Okay, and notice my opponent is up one pawn, and the pawn is a very dangerous pawn over here on a4. And you're thinking, my God, he's got a strong bishop. He's got an active rook. He's got an a4 pawn. Yeah. Passed pawn. I've just got a knight. How am I going to save this game? Right? It just looks completely dead. And I'll show you what I did first and show you how inept it was. Okay, and maybe we can learn from this, from my mistakes. So what I did is I noticed that, I really wanted to activate my king, thinking the only chance I had was to activate my king and either attack his king or maybe attack the h3 pawn. All right, I'm going to try to move this over just a little bit to see the chat. Increase it this way. Okay. So I was going to try to get my king to g5, but the problem is that the king is tied down right now. He's got a double attack on the f7 pawn. So I played he played king e2. Sorry, played king e2. Then I played f6. So now it frees my king up to move to g5. Okay. So what did he do? He played a5. And I thought, oh, that pawn's going. I'd better get behind it. I played rook a1, which is not such a good move. He kept it going, and I said, okay, well, now I get to move my king up. I moved my king up, and he kept marching. I played king f4. Now I tried to attack his king. My best bet was, at this point, was to go after the h pawn, but it still is a very difficult position for black. I went to f4, and he went to a7, and then I realized I'm screwed because, well, here I am sort of half attacking the white king. But if you notice, I can't even play rook a2 check because the bishop covers the square. So how am I going to attack the king if I can't even check him? And not only that, it was at this point that I realized that, he can't queen the pawn without moving this rook with tempo. But when he moves the rook now, I notice the f8, and I take his pawn, which I have to. He's going to take on f6, and actually not only lose the f6 pawn, but I lose my knight as well, because the only place for my king to go is g5. And after that, he can fork me on f5 with a rook, and I lose the knight. It's awful. But unfortunately, I had nothing to do. I can't really solve that problem, because if I move my king, say I move it back here, he just checks on g8 and queens the pawn next. So I played a lame move for k3. I had no idea what else to do. He played here, and I had to ditch my knight just to survive, and it was over. So that was my inept try to save the game. All right, so let's see if we can do better. So he plays king to f2. All right. So first of all, one thing we can observe is that if we want to get any kind of chances here, there's no way we can stop this a pawn. The only chance we have, you have to conclude, is an attack on the king. Okay. But honestly, deep down, I didn't really believe I could really do any damage to the king with just so few pieces. I mean, all I have is a rook and a knight, right? And maybe a king. Completely wrong viewpoint. I just didn't have an appreciation at the time for how effective an attack between those three pieces can be. So one thing you can say right away is you don't want to put the rook off the b file, because from the b file, you can at least check on b2, and the rook can be an active participant in any kind of attack. So rook a1 was terrible because I couldn't even use the rook for attack. And secondly, time is of the essence. Okay, we can't take time to tidy up our position and play moves like f6 to save this f pawn, because it just wastes too much time. So can anybody see what the right move is here for black? Knight d3 check, a good suggestion. It's an attacking move. The only issue is after knight to d3 check, you say king e3. And then now you haven't really gained time because he's attacking your knight. You don't have any particular mating in that, but it's the right idea is to attack. So that's not quite the right try. Any other suggestions?
King G5 maybe to start counterplay.
Yes, that's it. Very nice. King G5 right away. Honestly, it's kind of silly to me now that I've seen this, I understand it better. But at the time, I thought, my gosh, if I just give up more pawns, I'll just be even more lost. But the way you lose here is by not taking your chance when you have it. Hey, the pawns don't matter. I'm down. This pawn is enough to win the game for him under most circumstances. So you don't care if he has other pawns. But I was so afraid of giving up the F pawn that I didn't do this. Now, King G5, the idea is simply to get it to F4 and use this piece, and this piece to attack the other enemy king. Let's see how it works. So he might take on F7. Okay. And clearly we don't take back because then we end up in just a lost rook and pawn. But you just keep going. You don't care about the H5 pawn. You play King F4. Right? And already White has to be careful. I mean, Bishop A takes H5 is fine. And now we're down 3 pawns, right? Which is anathema. But the remaining pieces coordinate so well, White actually has to be careful. He could lose. Play rook to E2 check. And you get all kinds of possibilities here. For instance, say he plays bishop to E2 to block. Then we simply play knight to D3 check. And he has nowhere good to go. I mean, for instance, if he leaves the bishop, we can take the bishop, and black should be able to draw that endgame because his king can, if White gives up his bishop, say the King G1, we can just take here. We have plenty of activity and plenty of resources to stop these pawns. So he has to keep on the bishop. He has to play here, but then we just simply check again. He has to go here. It's the only legal move. And then we go back and pin the bishop. And he has to go back to protect it, and we get a draw. So after rook here check, the main idea is maybe King E1. And can anybody suggest a move now? I mean, there are a couple good ones, but there's one that's very obvious. We want to start weaving a mating net around the king, right? Okay. No suggestions? Yeah, King E3. Good. King E3. Exactly. And suddenly, what's more important, the 3 pawns or these attacking pieces? We've got serious attacking chances against the white king. Like, for instance, he can already lose by playing king to D1. Obviously, we're threatening a pretty serious check on B1 right now. I could even lose by playing, king D1, and then we play knight to D3. And next thing you know, rook to D2 is going to be mate. Whoops. So he has to play king F1. And let's see how this draw works. We have to play rook H2. Okay. And if he plays, say he plays rook E7, like this, and here's how we draw. We play knight to D3. Bishop might as well cover the pawn. We play knight F4, and suddenly we have another kind of mating net here, at least enough to draw. He has to play king G1. And this is pretty cool. Watch how we draw here. We go rook G2 check. He has to go in the corner, or it's a repetition at the very best. And then suddenly you go here, and he can't avoid a perpetual between G1 and G2. So the specifics are nice, but the real point is, if you're gonna try to fight against in a bad ending, activity is key. And we go back, if you check out the difference between that position and what I did, right here, you see that, I was too materialistic, too worried about stopping his pawn. All the wrong mindset for this position. The only chance black has is to counterattack, and so I should have gone king G5 into F4 right away. Okay. So the funny thing is, as you know, I have a chess coach now, Eugene Perelstein, and he's a GM. And when we were thumbing through this game, I was showing it to him. He saw this within seconds. I said I played F6 here, and he just, whoa, what are you doing? That's just wrong. And I said, okay, what? And he says, just play king G5. And I said, well, he takes my pawn. Just play king F4. He gave all 3 pawns. And the reason he knew this stuff is not only because he's GM, but he said studying endgames, solving endgame studies when he was a kid over and over again made him realize the power of these attacking themes against the king. So it's interesting that your intuition can be developed, so you don't even have to think about these things. Pretty cool. So it reminded him of a pretty neat game that he saw that I want to show next, which is really good. It's a game, Magnus Carlson versus Levon Aronian from the Candidates Tournament in 2007. He said this is kind of a game they remembered and inspired him when he was, when he was younger, or he remembered. So here we pick it up after, let's see, after white has just played King H2. And you see we have a situation where, white has 3, 4, 5, 6 pawns, black has only 5 pawns, right? But in fact, you see white has great knight here on E5. Black has kind of a suspect bishop. However, after black's next move, you realize that black is attacking white's C3 pawn. And once he takes the C3 pawn, which is impossible to defend, he'll have his own counterplay with his C pawn here. This might be able to run, right? So he played rook A3. And the first thing to think about is, okay, how would you feel in this position for white? Would you feel that it's starting to slip away from you, that you're better, or what would you think? If I had to be honest, if I got into this position, before knowing what I've learned from these exercises I've been doing, I would have been a little worried for white, thinking, gosh, unless if I allow rook takes C3 and I don't, mate the guy, this C pawn could actually cause horrendous counterplay, and D4 would be weak. And I could actually see myself losing this game as white, to be honest. Obviously that might cause you to look for some kind of bailout move or some kind of defensive idea instead of trying to attack. What should the mindset be here for white?
Well, white has more pawns, right? So
one more pawn, yep. But he's about to lose it on C3, so it's going to be yep.
I mean, could he just take G6?
Okay, that's a possibility.
Another pawn?
Right. He could. He absolutely could. In fact, that would be the move that I would be drawn on. If I'm being honest, I'd be drawn to that move because it's like a safe haven, right? But what do you really think about knight takes G6? The idea is knight takes G6, F takes G6, and you get your piece back, or rook takes E6. What does that ending look like to you?
King F7.
Mm-hmm. First, I'd probably take on E3, I guess. But I don't want him to come back to E3 and rook to E3 and protect the pawn and take on C3 first, right?
Yeah.
And the king's going to stop that F pawn. The rook and pawn can't force themselves through, right? And meanwhile, black will have counterplay with the C pawn and counterplay against the D pawn. Hell, you may get 2 connected pass pawns himself. Does that look like a win to you for white?
Not really.
No, it doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't to me either. So let's go through it just to show it can be done here. And that F pawn is really not going anywhere. And black's going to use the C pawn to distract white so he can take the D pawn. And this is just a sample line, but it's the way it would generally go. You don't even have to take the F pawn yet, because now you're threatening rook H4 check and rook takes H5. And this is just a dead draw. So this is a trap that you can fall into. I mean, honestly, you might go into it knowingly saying, gosh, I'm scared about rook takes C3. I want to bail out to a drawn ending, but rook endings have a big drawing tendency. So if you want to win, generally you avoid these rook endings. Of course, there are all kinds of exceptions, but generally rook endings have a high drawing capacity. So what should your mindset though be in this position as white? Okay, the answer is you should think, well, okay, black's going to get his pawn. I can't stop him from taking on c3. However, I've got this guy, this guy, this guy, and maybe this guy that can all attack this guy. So before I bail out into a drawn rook ending, let me at least see, is there any way I can use these guys to attack while he's taking my stuff? Because while the rook takes on c3, that rook is not defending the king. Okay, and the bishop really doesn't do a great job of defending the king either, because there's all kinds of holes on the dark square. Okay, so that's the mindset. Now we're learning here, right? So the question is, how do you arrange your pieces to create any kind of attack on the king? What makes sense? If you could ideally post your pieces, where would you put them? Okay. Knight takes g6 wins the bishop. Yeah, okay. We did just talk about that, right? We talked about knight takes g6. Oh, I see. Knight takes g6, he gets his piece back, but it's a drawn rook ending. We got knight c6 as an idea. Okay, and with the idea of knight e7 check, rook to b8, rook to g8, rook to g7. Yeah, that's a great idea. So the idea from Greg is a great idea. Okay, it's to get the knight to e7. So you put this guy here, and this is fine. We can fantasize. It doesn't really matter how many moves it takes. You put the rook on b8. The king goes up to h7, and then you can put the rook on g8. Very good. Okay. And you got a threat of rook g7 check, and the king is really boxed in. But the more you look at it, the more you realize you can't do anything else. Okay? You can check the king to kingdom come, but it's just a draw. Does that make sense? It really boxes in the king, so it's very attractive, but it just doesn't quite create a mating net. Okay, but it's a great suggestion, and absolutely a great first way to look at it. Thanks. This one's a tough one. So that's a, I mean, hey, worst comes to worst, at least it's definitely not a loss, right? Yeah, I remember Eugene showed me this position, and I really struggled to find the right arrangement of pieces. But one thing to notice, you got to start observing stuff and noticing things that helps you guide you to the right solution. It's not the right move, but let's just say, for instance, you've got other things you can use to attack. I forgot to include this guy, h-pawn. If we play h5 right now, it's interesting to notice that black really doesn't have many choices once we play h5. Okay. For instance, let's say he plays g5. Then it gets serious, because now we've created a strong square on g6. You can actually play knight to g6 here. And once you notice that, things start kind of opening up. And if he takes, 1 second, h5, g5, knight g6. If he takes, you take back, and now you're threatening to play rook to b8. Mate. Okay. And this actually is strong enough to win the game. He might play here, okay, but then you take this bishop and you're in good shape, right? So that's a really strong threat. So after h5, he can't leave it here either, because if you take, then you undermine the, I'm sorry, if you allow taking on g6, you undermine the bishop. So his only move after h5 is to take. And that's something to keep in mind. So can anybody see any way we can create some kind of mating net around the king? Okay, let's see. King h3. Okay, so you want to play h5, g takes h5, and just run the king up and mate. Interesting. That's a suggestion to play h5. And after g takes h5, just keep running the king all the way up to h6 and checkmate. Sorry. Let's see, how would black defend against this? I think the problem here is that the black rook is going to get active enough to check from the back. For instance, let's say you play it here. You could play king h3. Oh, I can't play king g3, sorry. It takes, and then king h4. I'm wondering if something like rook to c1 would help, trying to get to h1. And it's not so easy to get the king in. Yeah, sorry. No problem. Thanks, Melly. Yeah, and then I'm not quite sure how it goes from here, because rook h1, potential problem. So it's a nice try. So what Carlson saw is a very interesting idea. Okay? He noted that obviously after h5, it has to be taken g takes h5. But what you want to do is you want to create an attack where you can keep your most aggressive pieces and you don't have to trade them off. Okay? So how do you do that? Well, he conceived of something really neat. Okay? He thought, okay, what if I play f4? Okay, I play rook b8 check, some combination of these. All right, I play h5. He has to take it, so the g pawn has to go. The king will be on h7. Okay, and then I can post the rook on f8. All this is really tough to avoid. And the idea then is that the move f4, f5 would kick the bishop away from defending f7, and the whole position would collapse. I know it's a very long-term plan, but it's pretty easy to see how you can maneuver your pieces here. Now, let's see how it worked in practice. Because from this position, Carlson calculated out to practically the end. So he played rook b8 check first to force the king to h7, and then he played f4. Okay, this starts the mating net. Rook takes c3. I mean, without this counterplay, the game's lost anyway, so black might as well take. Okay, then he played h5. Okay, we know now that if he plays g5, the whole thing collapses. You still have the same problem. I assume people can see that after we still have the knight g6 idea. Now we're threatening mate on h8. So he would have to take, and then we get a check on b7. He goes back, and we get back to that. This is even worse for black because he can't even defend the back rank. This is lost for black. You might play here, but then we can just go and attack the bishop. And this is over. We're threatening the bishop and rook e. So he has no choice but to take the pawn on h5 still, put the rook in f8, and guess what? f5's coming, and f7 is going to collapse. And that means that not only are the pieces coming close to mating the black king, but the f6 pawn is really dominant. f5, bishop takes, rook takes f7 check. So Carlson calculated to here from that original position, and he was pretty sure that this was winning. Pretty impressive stuff. But once again, we see how we've got a small number of pieces, but enough to cause problems and almost mate the black king. And that's the attitude you have to have sometimes if you want to win these games. So king g8, okay, and let's see how he finished it off. There are some interesting things here. First of all, he played rook g7 check, king f8. Now the king is stuck on a square where he has no exit points. So it's all you need to do is check on the back rank and you win. So he played rook to b7. Okay. and black played rook to a8 to stop that mate on b8. All right, so what do you do here? White is actually down a pawn now instead of up a pawn, but he's clearly got very good activity. How do you win from here?
March the king up.
Hey, that's a great idea. You got one more guy, right? You got the king. It's amazing to me what I've noticed in all these things. We've been taught to activate the king in the endgame, which is great, and oftentimes you do, but I found an amazing number of examples where the king is the last piece activated. Usually optimize your other pieces first. I don't know if that's a great rule of thumb, but that's what I've noticed. He played king g3. Now, here's the thing. Here's a very interesting idea that I didn't expect people to see, but knight f7 is a really cool idea. The idea simply is to play knight h6, okay, rook to g7, and then rook to g8 mate. So the knight supports the mate on g8. There is a problem with it here, though, and the only problem with it is that sadly now this square is available. The f7 square is available to the king. If I check on b8, so black actually can play rook a6 here, which spoils the whole thing. Not the easiest move in the world to see. And now if we check on b8, he would just take our knight and win. So that's the problem with it. But you got to keep those ideas in mind, right? Instead, he played king to g3. Very good. Bring the king up. Black played rook to d8. And what would you play now? Yeah, I assume that people who are thinking bring the king up would consider king f4 to be perfectly good, and that's true. That's what he played in the game, and it was fine, a fine move. But now, if you notice, the only problem with knight f7 before was that the rook could come to the 6th rank and threaten the f6 pawn. But now that's not possible because black put the rook on the unfortunate d8 square. If he goes to d6, he just gets taken by the knight. So this actually would have won. He would have had to do something like this. And actually, wait, I think this does win. I guess does rook d7 save it? I thought knight f7 actually won. Maybe it's the next move. Right. So king f4. Ah, yeah, after bishop b4, knight f7 would have won. That's right, because now he doesn't have rook d7 either. So he doesn't have rook d7, and he doesn't have rook to d6. And now this idea of knight takes h6, rook g7, and rook g8 mate win. But Carlson didn't see that. He played g3 just to save the pawn from the bishop. Pawn to c3. And here's where Carlson found just a simple win. He checked first. And he wanted tempos. King goes here. He checked again. So he got to the same position with the rook on g7. And then he was able to check with the knight in d7. And now the problem for black is that if he goes king to e8, then we simply play rook e7 with checkmate. So this forces him to give up the exchange, take back, and he's in plenty of time to stop the c pawn. So Aronian resigned. So I hope you liked that game, and it goes to show that the mindset you have to have when you get these dynamic endgames that aren't just, well, they're not static. I mean, there's lots of stuff going on. There's counterplay. You have pawns that you have to allow to queen. Notice that white was so active that, like in the last game, even though the other side had a passed pawn, it really never came close to queening because we always kept the other side occupied, right? All right, so I've got a couple more good examples. Should be better at it now. And let's see, this was the next one. It's my game against Grandmaster Alex Ivanov. I was black, and as you notice, I am a pawn down. He's got 6 pawns, and I've got 5. A little bit early in the game, I had to go a pawn to survive. And somehow I managed to reach this position. Okay. All right, this is a game after I moved 25 knight to c6. I just put my knight on c6. All right. So he played a move kind of expected and tried to keep the pressure on. He played queen to d7. So now that we've seen a couple of examples of what to do, black, okay, as the defending side, try to be active. Or if you're trying to win, the aggressive side, try to be active. What do you recommend here for black? He's attacking your b7 pawn, threatening maybe queen f8, e8 check, which would force me to play queen to f8 to block. So do you have any suggestions here? Let me open up the chat here. And the problem, of course, is at this point in sudden death, both of us were in time trouble. So it's really hard to take long thinks, you know?
Knight takes pawn, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. You want to even up the pawns, right? That was certainly a candidate move. And in fact, that's what I played because I just couldn't stomach being 2 pawns down if I let him take on b7. But here's the problem. The problem was that after knight takes e5, which was a bad move, he played a good move, which is queen to d8 check. And that forced me to play my queen back to f8, which is completely undesirable. Then he attacked both 2 things. He attacked my knight and attacked the pawn. And unfortunately, I couldn't save them both. So I had to allow him to take my pawn. I played knight g4, and there was really nothing better. Knight d3 was okay, but I'd lose both b7 and a7. He played this nice finesse, bishop d1, I went back, and then he took my pawn. And I was down an important pawn. Queen was still active. And my pieces, as you can see, are pretty sad now, right? They were much more active a few moves ago. So I had seen that I had to move my queen back, but I just couldn't stomach the idea of not taking the pawn, which was bad choice, bad thinking. So that being said, seeing how the game went, what improvement would you suggest for black? And the sad thing is I saw this move too, but I just couldn't bring myself to play it. Bitter memories here.
G5.
And G5, what's the idea?
Well, then you don't have to retreat your queen to F8.
That's a nice try, actually. I like that thinking. Thinking is to try to stay active and not have to drop my queen back from its nice post on c5. Absolutely good thinking. Now, he can take my pawn, right? With h takes g5. Then you take on e5. I guess he takes on b7 probably. And that's probably better than what I did in the game, to be honest. Probably better than what I did in the game. But you still end up 2 pawns down, right?
Well, your knight is going to go to E5, and then maybe it's going to go to G4, and then good things might start to happen.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Let's try to follow through a little bit. Let's see. G5. I assume he takes. Is there anything better? I mean,
Yeah, might as well.
Queen e8 check, Queen g7. Then given the g7 square is pretty good. Can't play Queen d8 check. It would probably be desirable, but it's not possible. So yeah, let's just take. Okay. And I guess you want to take with the knight here.
Well, unless queen to C1 check is something.
Yeah, Queen c
And
h2.
I don't know.
think so. You could take back this pawn. But then maybe we just get queen takes b7. And then we're attacking the knight and the a pawn. So yeah, probably just knight takes e5. And I assume queen d8, f6 is not that big a deal.
Well, if you're, as long as you're only trying to draw, that should be.
That should be fine. I don't see a mate or anything there.
Well, wait a second.
Well, maybe knight h5 at the end is a problem.
Yeah, knight h5 will cause problems.
But it's not necessarily over because we got queen d8, king g7, queen f6. Maybe you can go king f8, knight h5.
Well, yeah, that's logical. Oh, well, wait, but then queen h8. Oh, this is annoying. It's annoying to have to follow through. Instead of taking the e pawn, I think maybe we should have played queen takes c1 check and taken the
G pawn.
G pawn.
We'll look at that in a second because I think
Yeah.
that's not quite done yet
Okay.
because you got knight h5. Okay.
Yeah.
That threatens queen d8 mate. But now you do have queen c1 check, king h2, and knight g4 check, right? Does that lead to anything? That's the question. I think the problem is that maybe you have king to h. Wait, where did the king go there? King g3 maybe? Pretty tricky. Let's play it out and see. So we got this.
Whoa.
Yeah,
Knight takes queen looks good.
yeah, knight takes queen looks really good. Exactly. So that doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So it's interesting. Yeah, so that's why I wasn't sure I wanted to give up on knight takes e5. Just it's pretty cool. So queen d8, f6 is no good, right? So let's just go ahead and play queen takes b7. But you might have enough activity here to draw, actually, right?
Yeah.
First of all, knight d3 looks pretty good, right?
First play queen c1 check, see if he's going to play knight f1, because if he does, then we play bishop d3.
Bishop d3, yeah. Yeah,
And if he doesn't, then we take on g5, and now we have the possibility of perpetual,
Mhm.
Queen
Queen
h6
h6.
and queen c1
Yeah.
and so on.
Yeah, no, that's a good suggestion. And if we play knight d3, maybe he has what, queen f3? Possible queen f3.
Oh, excuse me. I wasn't paying attention.
Yeah, if we play knight d3, you might just have queen f3, and that kind of covers some stuff, right? I mean, we have knight takes b2 there.
Yes.
Might not be so bad, but maybe some kind of knight h5 attack would be annoying there, huh? So yeah, I like your suggestion better. The queen c1, king h2. I mean, looks
Yeah.
worst. Yeah, and then we can either play queen takes g5 or does knight g4 do anything? Knight g4
We're
looks
practically
good.
winning here.
Yeah, looks kind of dicey here.
Queen h4 or f4, sorry.
Yeah, this looks good. King h5 and maybe
Bishop g6 check.
yeah, maybe bishop g6. Right, exactly. So good. Yeah. So g5 is a very interesting suggestion. Let's see what the engine thinks. Says it loses.
Oh, darn.
Maybe g takes h5 is h takes g5. Right?
I see. It wants to play something other than h takes g.
Interestingly enough, we misanalyzed this because queen d8 check. King g7, you don't play queen f6 check, you play knight h5 check. Yeah, so this is a shame. And this loses. So it was a good
Yeah.
And then I guess bishop d1, right? Wait, what's the right move? Yeah, bishop d1. This is still a draw. Something went wrong here. Bishop D1 here, yeah.
Yeah, there's where you play bishop to D1.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so G5, nice try, but the problem is it opened up the king, right?
Yeah.
So you have the right basic idea. But think about another way to do a very similar thing. What did you do with G5? You made it so the back rank wasn't such an issue.
Yeah.
So how can you do the same thing in a much simpler way? Hey, somebody got it. Very nice. Very nice. And the sad thing, like I said, is I saw this move and I just couldn't bring myself to play it. Good suggestion. Bishop B1. Great move. The merit of this move is that it allows the queen here to stay active. The issue is that when we have a check on the back rank now, we can play the king to H7 instead of being stuck on the back rank, or stuck moving the queen back to F8. Okay. And yes, he can take a pawn on B7, but then we're able to take on E5 with the knight, and suddenly look at the difference. Remember in the actual game, the way I played, my pieces ended up huddled on F8, F6, and H7. Whereas here, my queen's on C5, doing a great job attacking on C1 and F2, excuse me, and also covering the A7 pawn. My knight's on E5, and the bishop, okay, well, the bishop's out of the way, at least on B1. So these three pieces are very active. So if I had any time, I would hope I would figure this out. But still, intuitively, this is just the right way to go, right? And it's actually, white has no advantage now, despite being a pawn ahead. Let's see how it might work out. There's a very interesting point here. Yeah, now, you got to do something here as white to negate this. I mean, there's knight D3 is a threat. Possibly knight G4 is a threat. Queen C1 is a threat, right? Queen C1 takes B2 is possible, maybe. So a natural move here is knight E2, right, to stop Queen C1 check. And here's how powerful black's position is here. My inclination would be to play knight to D3 to attack F2 and B2. But it's a bit awkward in that the bishop on B1 now is not in great shape, right? So believe it or not, the best move in this position is not knight D3, but you have time as black to play bishop to G6. And now the pieces coordinate much better because now knight to D3 is a huge threat and it doesn't block the bishop out. White can't do anything. I mean, for instance, if they play knight C4 to try to take advantage of the bishop on G6, we see the easy reply is queen C1 check. That drops the knight. And so he has to play something like, knight C3, block the queen from going to C1. And then we drop the knight into D3 and we're attacking F2 and B2. He has to choose which one to protect. So he protects one on F2. And if black wants to secure a draw, obviously knight takes B2 is a move that comes to mind, but there's even a better move here. And it's all about keeping activity. Can anybody find the even better move than knight takes B2? Bishop H5. It's an interesting idea. Doesn't it drop the knight though? I think, okay, bishop H5, I think just drops the knight on D3. Okay. No problem. No problem. Yeah, this is a little bit of a subtle one. It's nothing spectacular, but it just shows how you don't have to go crazy and keep taking your material back at first possible moment. You can keep your pieces active. Queen E5 is the best move. The reason is that it threatens to go queen to E1 check and win the F2 pawn. And it's quite annoying for white. In fact, the only move for white really in this position is queen E2. Now you could try bishop C2, sorry, but then you get the queen E1 check and the F2 pawn drops. Wait, that's not it. I don't know why I had that in, but you can take the bishop first and then wait. What am I talking about? This is ridiculous. Sorry, my notes are bad. Yeah, this should be a perfectly fine for black. After bishop c2, queen e1 check. This must be some analysis I did with somebody. Sorry, but queen e2 is the move, and then you actually get the queens traded off first, and now you take the b2 pawn, and this is an easy draw for black, especially with the queens off. So anyway, that's a really interesting picture. If you look at it back here again, that the way I did it, I played knight e5, and pretty soon we saw what happened to my pieces. If you look at them over here, it's just crazy how passive they are. And if you look at the way it should have been done, just a few moves, we see the difference, and we see how active they are. Whole change in picture, and it almost doesn't matter how many pawns there are. I've got two more examples. Let's see. All right, this is a game against Mark Hebden. Okay, he's a GM from England. And once again, same deal earlier in the game. I got into trouble and had to pitch a pawn, get to this ending, and try to defend it. And I was trying to figure out a way to play actively so I could not repeat my earlier mistakes. And even though objectively I didn't play the best move here, at least it had an idea and it made him think and caused some disruption. So we're picking it up right here after White had just played knight to d3. And I played f5. I know it created a big hole in e5, but I wanted to use my f pawn to try to disrupt his pawn chain, make d4 weak. I wanted to play f4, and if he took it, have d4 be weak. Let's see how he responded. He actually responded very interestingly. I didn't expect this, but he played g4. And of course, I pushed past, and he took. Well, actually, after rook a1, sorry, rook a1 first. Allowed me to play rook a2, which I was happy to keep activating my pieces. And then he played e takes f4. All right. So again, some interesting stuff now. Because first I played knight e2 check because it certainly shuts his rook out. He played king g2, and I played e takes f4. Now we can see that my ploy has worked a little bit because even though I'm a pawn down, this pawn is weak. My pieces are pretty active. And he still has to figure out how he's going to, get out of this and convert his material advantage. Resize a little bit. Okay. So let's see what he played. He played knight to c5. All right. And here's like the first real critical point here. He's obviously played knight c5 because he wants to threaten knight takes e6 check and maybe try to get rid of this f4 pawn. And my first thought actually was to use the pin on the, well, actually my first thought, of course, was to take on d4. But the reason I rejected that is not just because of knight takes e6 check, which actually isn't too bad for black. I'll show you why. But the more I was worried about was rook e4. And this, unfortunately, means he wins the pawn, one of the pawns in a more favorable way. If he takes on e6, I wasn't so worried about that because the knight takes e6, rook takes e6. And actually, rook to b3 is very powerful. Once again, note how if you can get down to a rook ending where you're pawn down, a lot of times you have a lot of drawing chances. This one move right here threatens rook to g3 check. And it's hard to stop. This is the kind of stuff that can happen. And now after this check, you can push f3, and we're not going to get mated on the 8th rank because our rook can come back to e8. And black is absolutely fine here. So, but I was worried about knight takes d4 because of rook e4. And indeed, it wins. So the next thing I looked at was, how can I use the pin along the 2nd rank and I thought about, what about knight G3? I'm trying to be active here, right? But the issue is that the F4 pawn is not stable. After rook G1, now say I double rooks, which I was thinking of doing, then unfortunately he gets to take on E6 with check, then take here with check, and the knight on G3 loses its support. So I had to abandon that line. Okay, so those two things in mind, knowing what we know about trying to remain active to try to save the game, what move would you consider or suggest for black here? Okay, F3 check, yep. That's very nice. F3 check is a very active move. You're trying to bring the king in, play knight takes D4 with check, right? Good. In fact, that's what I played in the game. It turned out to be not the best move, but your thinking was basically along the lines of what I was at least trying to stay active. It just didn't quite work. But you have the right mindset for sure. Thanks for the suggestion.
Rook to B6.
See, rook to B6. Okay, interesting idea. Rook to B6 kind of holds the status quo, right? It holds the E6 pawn. The rest of the pieces are still active. Certainly not a bad try, but in the interest of playing as actively as possible, can you see an even more active move than that, though?
I keep looking at knight G3, but I don't know what that wins. So.
Right. Yeah. Knight G3 was unfortunately it was distracting me too much. But even though I figured out it didn't work. Okay. So, but think active. What's like the? I mean, I'm really ashamed I didn't see this, but unfortunately I was already in quite bad time trouble. I could only calculate so many lines at once. That's my excuse, and I'm sticking to it. But there's a really active move here that makes a lot of sense once you see it.
King F6.
Oh, King F6. Okay, it keeps the pawn. Yep, it activates the king a little bit. But as you know now, since we're looking at these, we don't care about pawns so much, right? We care about active pieces. So let's look in that direction. H5. That's a good idea. H5. You're trying to at least pry open the position a little bit more. Not sure what the best response is to H5. Maybe knight takes C6 check. I don't know. Okay, but keep looking. There's a better move.
Rook A3.
Rook A3, rook takes E2.
F3 check.
F3 check. Good idea. Okay, is that enough? It's probably good. Yeah, that's a good idea. Nice idea. What would white play then, do you think, after rook A3?
Well, knight takes pawn check.
Yeah, king F6.
And and now say knight or D5. And now let's see.
Yeah, and maybe that's just the rook on A3.
It's not doing enough.
Yeah, that's a nice try though. Nice try. Yeah, so we've talked about this knight G3 idea a bunch of times, right? I see D5. You mean E5 maybe? I'm not sure. But yeah, setting up this knight G3 to actually mean something is a good idea. And it's a really active move to begin with. It's rook to B2, which somehow escaped my attention. We maximize all our pieces, right? And our threat now is knight to G3. Because when you think about it, we attack the rook on F1 rather, and if it moves, then F2 collapses. We don't even care about knight takes E6. King F7 turns out to be slightly better than King F6 for some subtle reason. It's actually because when the knight moves again, it won't have a fork. But after d6, now we play knight g3. And the reason the king goes to f7 is that if the knight takes an f4, it doesn't get a check next. But here, the best white can do is sack the exchange. The knight takes f4. But black has enough activity here to hold up and draw the game. So once again, we see another example where active play is much more important than material. And it gets even better. Check out what happens next. So I missed that when I played f3 check. And I was very fortunate my opponent bought my bluff. I even knew during the game it didn't work. If he plays king f3, he wins. Knight takes here, he goes back, and unfortunately, he just starts unwinding and actually wins. The problem here is that black's pawns are too weak. They're too far apart and too weak. I thought I had some maybe drawing chances here, but I was wrong. But he obviously agreed with me because after I played f3 check, he played king h2. I'm back in business. All right, so now we've got to figure out how to proceed again. I missed my chance of rook b2. And here's where we got to come up with some idea about getting active here and trying to create some kind of mating net. Any suggestions here? This is really neat. So somebody actually already suggested this move once. It's actually more powerful now for a very concrete reason. Very nice. I'm going to give a shout out to Greg. Good job. H5. Unfortunately, I didn't play it because I didn't see the whole range of ideas here. Let me explain the thinking behind H5. Notice that the knight on E2 covers these three squares. Okay. So the thinking is if black can open the H file, then a rook H8 could actually mate white, right? Which is exactly the kind of stuff we're looking for when we're down material trying to save an endgame. So how on earth do you open up the H file? Well, H5 and H takes G4, right? Of course, there are two things that you see instantly that are wrong with that, right? I mean, problems that crop up. When you play H5, no law says that he has to allow you to take and take back and mate himself. I mean, for instance, he could take on H5 himself and keep the H file closed. Or he could even play knight takes E6 check. We have to take both into account. But like most good ideas in chess, they have more than one dimension. And can anybody see what the problem is after G takes H5? I didn't see this, and that's the reason I rejected this move. Oh yeah, somebody mentioned that you could play G5 here, but I'm guessing that here the idea would have to be something like H4, creating a mating net, and then trying to just take back that G pawn and trying to take it down the G file. Yeah, so somebody didn't see the answer. Let's see what happens on G5. I'm curious. Yeah, that's it. H4 creates a mating net. And you actually get this kind of thing. Now the knight has support on G3. And this is a big problem for white because F2 collapses. So G5 doesn't work either, but it was a good try. Yes, somebody mentioned it. Very good. After G takes H5, what I failed to notice that not only is the H file a problem for white, But after king h6, great move, fantastic move. It's not to capture the pawn back, but it's to use the G file. I didn't realize at the time that the G file, rook to G2 check, was such a devastating problem for white. So we can see how, let's play some normal moves like knight e6, rook g8, rook g1. I mean, otherwise I just play a rook g2 check, and black or white easily could get into trouble, because of knight g3 check. For instance, let's say you play d5, right? And you play rook g2 check here, and we've got this devastating move, knight g3 takes, and we made him. So we see the issues that this provides for white. We play rook g8, just play rook g1, we take it, and this is actually losing, it seems, for white. So very good. That to me was eye-opening. And not only that, there's another way. If he doesn't play g takes h5, but watch this. What do you think happens after knight takes e6 check? And then, of course, we play king f6, and then he plays something like knight c5. What happens then? H takes d4. H takes d4 is certainly a good idea. If he takes back, then rook h8 is mate. Let's see, what would you do on h takes g4? I wonder if is there an intermediate check of some kind? Oh, we forgot the problem that the threat is knight to d7 check, and black loses. So unfortunately, as we often find, sometimes we forget about our opponent's moves. That's what would happen after h takes g4. Yeah, it's okay. That happened, but we always have to be careful. Yeah, I find this to be really incredible. The answer is we start using our king for attack. King g5. It gets out of the fork. I mean, we're threatening h takes g4 now, which is exactly the move we want to play. So he has to play g takes h5. And then the want to move king h4. Bleeding pawns, but getting all our pieces active. And now we've got ideas of mating him with our remaining pieces. We're going to play rook to g8, rook to g2 check, and then we even get our king involved. Isn't that amazing? Yeah, in my opinion, if you don't like this stuff, there's no point in playing chess. This is amazing stuff to me. So it shows great example of how activity trumps material. And black should be able to save this game. So instead, my old after f3 check king h2, I missed this opportunity. I considered h5, but I just didn't see the g file stuff. I only saw the h file stuff. And instead, I played a terrible move. I played rook e8, almost acquiescing to a loss. This is anathema. You should not deactivate your pieces like this. My excuse was time trouble, all this other stuff. I think my toe hurt. I'm sure I had asthma. I don't know. There's a whole bunch of problems. He just played rook d1. I tried to lash out with e5, but it's not getting anywhere. He's got a pass pawn, and I just lost. I thought I had one last trick here with rook e2. And for a moment, I had hopes because he can't take the rook because I take back, and if he plays rook e3, then I think everyone can see that we just queen, he takes, and then we get this nice fork on f3. So I was thinking, well, he can't take here because of this. He can only stop the pawn this way, so to speak, but then we play queen here and then check. And black's in good shape there. But he took like just a minute to find the right response, which was rook e3. And now I'm just dead. So sadly, it was over. I finally played h5, but too late. And now there's just no way to no way to continue. He has enough resources to push his pawn through. And I lost. But the lessons are, I hope that we've learned here that a lot of times you get in these pawn down situations, activity is absolutely your friend. And this fantastic, after king h2, this fantastic h5 move, sorry, there's something to remember, especially with the king marching. All right, so we're down to one final example. It's actually from my coach, Eugene. And this is actually, when I showed him my games, he was reminded of this one. This is his game against Alex Yermolinsky from the US Championship in 2008. Okay, and that was interesting. From the opening, Eugene got a small advantage, but over time, Yermolinsky neutralized it. And we ended up in this roughly equal position here. But Eugene told me he could tell even from the board and from talking to Yermolinsky after the game that Yermolinsky thought his position was quite safe and couldn't even really conceive of any way to lose it. That might be an exaggeration of what he said, but basically it's tough to see how Black will lose this game. The knight is very strong, and b4 equal pawns. The pawn on c6 technically is a weakness, but it's guarded very nicely. And the king appears to be very safe, right? So how on earth do you go about trying to win this game? And let's see what Eugene did, because it's very instructive. So first we had a little dance. He played knight a2. He was perfectly happy to take a draw. They had already repeated this position once. But instead of repeating with rook a1, Eugene decided that the only chance he had was to attack the black king. So to that end, he realized there was only one break he had, which is g4. And so he simply put his rook to g1. Okay, so he played knight b4. Yermolinsky played knight b4, and White played g4. And of course, Black does not want the game to open. So he played f4 himself. All right, and Eugene proceeded with his plan, and we'll see why in a minute. He played g5. Sorry, I'm gonna close the chat here. All right. So now Black realized that he had his own attack on this e3 pawn, right? And said, well, I don't have to sit here passively protecting c6. I can play rook e7 and attack the e3 square. And Eugene decided to force matters and went up and attacked. Okay. So now the Black, should have played f takes e3. Okay. And after f takes e3, he plays rook e6 and counterattacks his pawn on e3. And after rook c3, defending the pawn, move c5 would have been fine. Provided enough counterplay for Black to keep the game equal. But as stated before, Eugene got the sense that Black didn't quite sense the danger involved, and thought, well, okay, the position is fairly calm right now. There's no reason why I can't start getting my own play and get my pawns rolling. So he played b5. And can anybody see what the drawback of this b5 move is? And try not to think more as much in moves as in concepts. What does it allow? Okay. The answer is that it allows white to activate his rook. And this is exactly what white was waiting for, because after A takes, C takes, you know, to the, let's see, to the, I don't know, first glance, it looks like suddenly black has a chance of getting a connected passed pawns pushed down the queen side, and white's maybe courting chances of losing, right? But we can't forget about the activity of the pieces. And after rook c8, suddenly white has mating ideas. If you look, what we have here is we have a pawn on g5, which covers these two squares. And then if we could get our rooks to the h file, we'd actually have checkmate, right? Because we could put a rook on h8 and a rook on h7 and play mate. So black realized now that he had to act fast or he was going to get mated. So he played f takes e3. And what would you play here as white? As you might guess from our earlier examples, the one thing we want to stop ourselves from doing automatically is recapturing the pawn, right? Because not only, well, I mean, it's fine to recapture the pawn, but it does cost us a move, right? Is there any way to use the time we've gotten for black playing f takes e3 to activate our pieces? And the answer is yes, right? The answer is white plays rook h4. A great move by white. Once again, he's not worried about pawns. He's more worried about the initiative. And now he's threatening to play rook on c h8 and rook here checkmate. And it's very difficult for black to avoid this. We'll see in a second. Black played a very natural move here. He takes f2 check, king takes, and they brought his knight in to help. Knight d3 check. And of course, white put his king on a safe square, g3, king g3. And black realized he better counterattack or else he's going to get mated. So he played rook to e1. Trying to get counter chances by checking on g1, for instance. Okay, now what would you recommend for white?
Rook c7.
Okay, rook c7 is possible. Okay, the thing is, how do you continue if he just plays king g8, which is forced, of course. And you'd have to find some way to still create the mating net, right? If you had access to the d5 square, that'd be good, right? If you could check on the diagonal, would be okay. That's an idea, but you have to have something beyond. So rook c8 or c7 check, king g8. And how would you continue?
Well, at least rook c8 check is a draw, but I guess we're trying for more, right?
Yeah, we're trying for more, right? Exactly. So it's a nice idea to use your active rook, but the problem is you can't dig the king out of g8 and force rook h8 mate. If you could play bishop d1, which unfortunately not possible, you can get to maybe to b3. You could maybe play bishop g4 e6, but it's not, the e6 square is covered a bunch of times. I mean, to me, the most natural move would be rook on c to h8, right? Because now you're threatening mate. Next. Unfortunately, this is not the best move because after this here, you have to see this. Rook g1 check. You know, if you play king h2, your mating net goes away. And if you play bishop g2, which is a natural move, the issue is that the bishop is pinned. And yes, technically white's still winning, but it's much more complicated than it needs to be. Because after king f7, trying to escape b6, the natural way of keeping the mating net is simply to play d5. But since the bishop is pinned, black gets a chance to take the pawn and can sacrifice the exchange and make it very messy. So we really don't want our bishop to be pinned because we want it to support that d5 push. That being said, Eugene saw this and he played a really nice move here. Can you guys guess it? Any ideas? Any thoughts? Hopes, dreams?
King g2.
Very close. I think king g2 is just the wrong square. Let's try to figure out why. The move is king h2, actually. Beautiful move. I'm not sure yet why king g2 is worse. It might work too, but let's see if we can figure it out. Probably the idea is maybe the rook leaves e1 somewhere and threatens knight to e1 check. Maybe here. It's a little annoying. They might not have time to create the mating net. That's my guess. Whereas king h2, the king is far enough away where there's no chance of any kind of annoying checks here. That's probably the difference. And now the interesting thing is, after king h2, very good, and Bruce does a very good suggestion, realizing that the easiest thing to do is get the king tucked away. Now there's no more rook g1 check. And actually, black has nothing. The next moves are simply going to be rook over to h8, and then the other rook to h7. So black has to deal with that. And there's only 3 ways to do it. Okay. Let's see. First of all, the move played in the game was rook c1. Let's see if we can figure out what happens on king f7. Well, what would you do there as white?
D5.
Yeah, very good. Create the mating net. Okay. And again, we've got a problem that rook h7 now is mate. King e7 doesn't help. Rook h7 still mate. And if you go king g7, then rook here. There's actually a very crafty move here that after king h2 that black can try. I'm not sure if black considered this much, but the really interesting try is knight e5. Trying to give out the piece just to break the mating net and get to some kind of ending where you might end up with a rook and bishop versus rook or something. And the way you win here is quite interesting. Now it's attacking g5. Okay, and you got to think, okay, get rid of this. How do you proceed from here? Because if you lose the g5 pawn, the winning chances, generally would be gone. You have to have some kind of say compensation for that. And it's actually quite amazing. There's a real interesting trick here in that white just plays here, here, and then gets on the 7th. And of course, the only chance for black is to take the g5 pawn. Then amazingly, the rest of the pieces for white just keep attacking. And after this, threatening mate, rook goes back, and you play a simple king h3. And it's quite amazing that with the rest of the pieces white's going to just attack and mate him anyway. The rook is almost trapped on g5, but it can go to f5. If we just play bishop e4, rook e6, and just keep coming with the king. And when the king gets to, guess what, h6, the game is over. You can try to avoid it there, but now the issue is we've got mating with the rooks. So it's quite amazing. The king participates in the attack there and finishes off the black. Now he has a rook d6 check, but no rook g2 check because the bishop covers g2. Let's see if we can finish it off. After rook d6, how do you win? Yeah, I can envision here that what you want to construct is you want to go king g5, and then you can play bishop f5 and or bishop g6, and the idea is to try to get some battery like bishop g6 and king h6 and block the king, block the check, block the rook so they can get h6. You go to f5 here because now you're threatening bishop e6 check, and that's enough to win. I think, for instance, let's say you cover e6. What's the best way? Like say you go back. How would we win from here? Yeah, the easiest way has to be enabling bishop e6 check with something like rook e7, right? Now we're going to get the e6 check in. And this is game over. I mean, he plays here, for instance. Well, I mean, let's see. Yeah, how would you go?
I mean, the most flexible option is king f6, right? So
Yeah, king f6. I was thinking, okay, how do you respond to rook f8 check?
king d6.
That's what I was thinking too. Now you're attacking the rook on d5, and you're threatening rook on e to g7 mate, right? So what if he plays rook on f to d8 then?
Rook on f to d what?
Rook on f to d8. So he goes his rook back to the d file. He's mate.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's the problem. He's threatening rook to d6 mate, right? So we have to do something really fast. But we have it. Just keep looking. Actually, maybe I'm hallucinating. Yeah, we might have something better here.
Yeah, so maybe king e6 is invalid here.
I think there's actually a better move right from the start here. Yeah, there's a much better move right here than king f6.
Okay, king g6.
Yeah, king g6. I was thinking something else, but what do you do on rook on 8 to d6?
Bishop to e6 check.
E6 check and call it a day, right? That's the end.
Yeah.
I think that works. I was also thinking king h6. So king g6 I like. I think that's very good.
King h6 is nice. Ooh.
This one here, this one looks like it wins because the king covers the rook, right? That's
Yeah.
important. So, but king h6 is another way. I think it's also valid.
Very nice.
And the idea is if he takes, then you got rook check and thanks. Of course, the other.
Poetic, more poetic.
Yeah, I mean, it's slightly more aesthetic. Who knows? But your move was just fine, Bruce. Just fine. So that's how the game ended. It was very constructive. So black tried, like I said, instead of knight to e5, he tried rook c1. Now, of course, you're not going to trade rooks. And you need your rooks to mate him, so you play rook ch8, which makes perfect sense. You play king f7, and then we all know the move here. Doesn't take a grandmaster to play this move, d5, and the mating net is in place. And black resign. So that's basically all I had. I have one more really quick thing. Tuesday. Let's see. I'm playing these Titled Tuesday matches. I wish I had a better example of me learning from my mistakes, but I was actually playing Entitled Tuesday and used what I learned to save, well, come very close to saving a game against an international master. We got to this position where, oh yeah, so here it is right here. And I realized here things had gone wrong. I was about to lose this pawn on c4. Black is very active. I can't take on d5 because my knight drops on c3. I thought to myself, okay, I'm going to lose a pawn, not the end of the world, right? Let me turn out the notation. How do I get as active as possible so that when I lose the pawn, I've got enough activity to compensate? And it finally became clear. This is a Titled Tuesday Blitz game, so it's 3+1, both sides. The key move here is to realize that after he takes on c4 and takes with a queen, okay, you're going to take with a queen probably, and the rook takes. How do we get to an endgame where we have some chances? Well, we certainly don't want our knight to be hit and have to move then after that. We want to be able to activate our rooks. So what I do is I play knight e2, which is the best move. And after he took, predictably, and now this, since the knight is not attacked, it's not blocking the rook, it allows me to play this great rook d6 move activating the rook. And yeah, I'm a pawn down, but at least I've gotten my rook active, and I've got this nice d4 square from the knight. Let's see how it went. He played rook a4, which makes sense. I could have actually played knight d4 here, but I played rook takes b6. He took the pawn, and I played knight d4. And yeah, he's up a pawn, but once again, I'm starting to get my pieces active. And my goal now was to get both rooks on the 7th rank. Took there, took on a6. Already having all the pawns on one side of the board is not bad. Played h6, I played rook a7. Attacked my knight. I went knight c6 to keep as active as possible. Rook e2, and now I just go rook b1, trying to keep my rooks on the, get my rooks on the 7th. And he really has no easy way to block this. Play knight h5. I of course doubled. Rook f8, and now came another key move. clearly I don't want him to mate my king, but also I want to dislodge this guy because then G7 would collapse. So the obvious move was to play G4, and he played this, and it's a draw. H2. Now, unfortunately, I'm a slow mover, and right here my time ran out before I could claim the draw. But it's just at least an example showing that, at least a small glimpse of how you can learn from your mistakes and get better in the future. Anyway, that's all I had. I want to thank everybody for listening. Thanks for your participation. I hope you learned something tonight. And any questions? Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff, for coming in tonight.
Yeah, no problem. I hope you found the games very instructive.
Oh, very.
Questions about the chess or anything like that, just give me a shout. Everybody knows how to reach me. And have a great night.
Mhm.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye, Mark.
All right. Bye, Jeff. Thank you.